Go ahead and take out your Bibles and turn to the 18th chapter of the book of Acts. Acts chapter 18. If you're following in the workbook, lesson 17. We're looking at Acts 18. The latter half of that year in just a moment. Before we get back into Acts chapter 18, though, we want to look at our outline that we're following for the book of Acts. We'll put our chapter back in its location in our outline and then review what we've seen already in chapter 18. The first 12 chapters of the book of Acts is about the gospel in Palestine. We have the gospel in Jerusalem in the first 7 chapters, and then after the persecution picks up at the beginning of chapter 8, and 8 through 12, we have it in the areas of Judea and Samaria. It's then in chapter 13 that the Apostle Paul, then still referred to as Saul of Tarsus, along with Barnabas, began the first of the 3 preaching journeys that Paul will go on in the book of Acts. And so beginning in chapter 13 and going through chapter 28, we have the gospel going to the uttermost parts of the world. We're still in that second journey here in chapter 18. In Acts 18, we're still on the second journey. This is the map of the second journey that we've been following. We set out from Antioch, came up to the Derbe, Lystra, and Iconium, over to Antioch of Pisidia. We started at Antioch of Syria. Came over to Antioch of Pisidia. Was forbidden to go into Asia, so we went to Troas, from Troas to Philippi, Thessalonica, and Berea. And then when we concluded 17, he was in Athens. And then what we saw on Wednesday was he was in the city of Corinth. And then move on down to Ephesus before returning back down here, head down to Jerusalem, and then head back up to Antioch, where we'll stay until he begins the third journey, which will be referenced here at the end of the chapter. Again, as we mentioned on Wednesday, we'll come back to this map when we're ready for it. But when we start the third journey, we'll look at it more when we get into the next chapter, as we get into more of the journey. But for now, we'll skip over that map because that's the beginning of the third journey, which starts in verse 23. The chapter here in Acts chapter 18 divides down into 3 major sections. We have them at Corinth, 1 through 17. The return trip to Antioch, 18 through 22. And the 23 through 28 is the beginning of the third journey. There in 23 through 28, really 24 through 28 mentions Apollos, and it's just verse 23 mentions that he goes through strengthening the church as Paul does, which is why we'll look at our map again when we get into the next chapter. We saw on Wednesday about the gospel in the city of Corinth. In verses 1 through 4, Paul began his work there at the city of Corinth. After he left Athens, he goes to Corinth. That's where he stays with, and we're first introduced to Aquila and Priscilla. They were tent makers. Paul, being of the same trade, stayed with them as he was in Corinth there at the beginning and worked with them in tent making. Paul in verse 4, as he does in each of the cities he goes to that has a synagogue. As we said before, there are times he went to a city that didn't have a synagogue, and he would find where the Jews that would be there would meet. But when there is a synagogue, Paul goes to the Sabbath. And so in verse 4, he goes and he reasons in the synagogue every Sabbath to persuade the Jews and the Greeks. At this point, early on, Paul is by himself in terms of the fact that Timothy and Silas were not with him at that moment. And so Paul goes every Sabbath and he reasons from the Scriptures with trying to persuade the Jews and trying to persuade the Greeks. Verse 5 then pointed out that when Silas and Timothy had arrived from Macedonia, that Paul was occupied with the Word. As we referenced, the New King James says he was compelled by the Spirit. The Legacy Standard says he was devoting himself completely to the Word. We know from other passages that Paul references the fact that he had received financial support, not at Corinth, but from other sources while working there, 2 Corinthians 11, 6 through 8. So perhaps it seems that this is a case where Paul has been previously working as a tent maker with Aquila and Priscilla to supply the needs. He wasn't receiving any support there from Corinth. And then he received some outside support. And that perhaps Timothy and Silas were the messengers bringing that to him because after they came he occupied or was devoting himself completely to the Word, and that's what he seems to be going on, just focused on his preaching and teaching. So it seems as Paul, as Silas and Timothy had brought Paul the financial support that was sent to him, and that's why he's now no longer having to work as a tent maker, but he's fully devoted on just teaching. Because he's trying to set an example before the brethren. That's why he was a tent maker before. As we see in 2 Thessalonians, if a man will not work, neither shall he eat. But now he's received his financial support, and so he has that support to continue just preaching and not worrying about having to worry about the other things to provide a living. And so then in verse 6, after Paul has devoted himself completely to the Word, that there's some opposition from the Jews in verse 6. The Jews had opposed him and reviled him, and so Paul shook his garments and said, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on I will go to the Gentiles." And so he's pointing out to the Jews there that, listen, I've done my part in that. I've taught you the gospel. If you won't receive it, there's nothing I can do about it, is what he's saying. So, as we referenced in Ezekiel, there's the illustration of a watchman. If the watchman is there watching over the city at night, if the enemy comes, he's to sound the horn and warn him. If he doesn't sound the horn and the city's overthrown, he's guilty. If he sounds the horn and the people don't respond, it's not his fault. If he sounds the horn, there's only so much he can do. Ezekiel was called a watchman, and once he done his responsibilities, he had a responsibility to teach, but once he met that responsibility, the blood be on their head. Paul's pointing out here, I've done our responsibility of teaching. It's not that you haven't heard the message, I've preached you the gospel message. Now, you're not responding, that's on you, not on me. Yes.
Yeah, Lord willing, we'll see there when he calls the elders down from Ephesus to Miletus, he kind of reiterates that same thing. He says, I'm innocent of the blood of all men. Why? Because I shun not the prayer of the whole counsel of God. And that's the principle for us today. We've got, we're not going to be innocent when we stand before God. We're commissioned to go out in the world and preach the gospel. We're not going to be innocent of the blood of all men if we don't take and maybe even make opportunities. And couple that with a prayer that the door of opportunity will be open and the gospel will have free course.
Yes, you're right. He does reference that there again later. And you're right, there's something for us to learn there about the fact of our responsibility. Your blood be on your head. That's why Paul, like he pointed out, he says later on, he's innocent. And why he says innocent here, I've met my responsibility, so now it's on you, yes.
And it's kind of twofold. We should do it because if we love our neighbors or ourselves, we want their soul to be saved too. But there's also that fear aspect that plays into it. It's kind of twofold. It should be that we're motivated by love, but we don't want anyone to be lost. God doesn't want anybody to be lost. So that should be the motivating force. But coupled with that's going to be the responsibility and that fear of their blood being on us if we don't make that proclamation of the gospel.
You're right. And there's a song we sing sometimes. You never mentioned it again. It's like 598 in our book. When it talks about in the better land before the bar we stand, how deeply grieved our souls may be. If any lost one there should cry in deep despair, you never mentioned him to me. And so you're right. There's twofold there: the love of the souls and the fact that they're lost, and then our responsibility and the fact that we'd be lost if we do not teach. And so Paul here says, I've met my responsibility in teaching. And so your blood is on your heads. From now on, I'm going to the Gentiles. So Paul continues there, working with the Gentiles. He left from there and went to the house of a man named Tedious Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. And Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord together with his household. And many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. And so there are many there that obeyed the gospel, including the ruler of the synagogue. And so Paul's continuing there in the work, and the Lord comes to him in verse 9 and tells him not to be afraid, but go on speaking and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you, for I have many in this city who are my people. And so Paul continued there for a year and 6 months. As we'll mention again in verse 18 with reference to the other day. He stayed many more days. Is the many more days included in the year and 6 months, or after that, I don't know, but he was there at least a year and a half working with the brethren at Corinth. As we pointed out on Wednesday, it's impressive the success the gospel has and shows the power of the gospel because of the effect that it had in the city of Corinth. First you have Crispus, who's the ruler of the synagogue, who's converted along with his family. But then there are many others who heard and believed and were baptized in Corinth. And as we mentioned on Wednesday evening, 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 11, 9 and 10 is a list of sins that if somebody said, what do you think? Again, I know all sins is evil, but from our standpoint, what humans tend to think, what are the worst sins? 9 and 10 of 1 Corinthians 6 lists what the human mind typically thinks of as the worst of things. And Paul said that's what those required come out of. And it shows the power of the gospel. Here are those who had lived deep in sin, in a city full of sin. A city where, I believe there's 1,000 prostitutes served daily in the temple. The temple's there. And yet these people, when they heard the truth, obeyed the truth. And it shows the power of the gospel. And the fact that here are these people that listened to what was being preached. It's then after that it's mentioned about him staying a year and 6 months and the success that was originally had that Paul goes before Gallio, who was the proconsul of Achaia. The Jews had made a united attack against Paul, saying that he was teaching, persuading men contrary to the law, and Paul was getting ready to give a defense, but it's then that Gallio says, if this were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. But since it's a matter of questions about words and names of your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be judge of these things. So we put it out on Wednesday evening. It seems the Jews, and as we read the quote on Wednesday evening, the Jews were trying to word it in such a way that he could take it either way. Gallio could take it either way. He's saying things contrary to the law, and perhaps their hope was that he was thinking that they were saying things contrary to Roman law, because, as we pointed out on Wednesday evening, there were certain religions that the Romans would recognize. One of those that they recognized was Judaism. And that perhaps they are saying he's teaching things different than the Judaism. And so this sort of doesn't fall under that umbrella, if you will, of what you've accepted, and so it's contrary to your law. Well, Gallio doesn't take it as it's contrary to Roman law. He takes it how they really, what their heart really was, and that is, it's not contrary to Roman law, it's contrary to your law. I'm not going to judge about that, he says. You judge about that yourselves. And so he drove them from the tribunal. It's then they see Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and they beat him in front of the tribunal, but Gallio pays no attention to any of the things, to any of this that was going on, and them beating Sosthenes before him.
These Jews weren't about using any deceptive practice to try to suppress the truth. And that's sad, you know what I mean? That's sad. Yes. They were supposed to be God's chosen people. And then Paul wrote to church report, and he said, you go to, and I know he's talking about people who are truly Christian, but he said, you go to law with one another. Mm-hmm. We should be able to resolve our difference. He said, is there not a wise man among you? It's sad when a Christian has to attack another Christian. Although, like I said, another contrast that here was Judaism and Christianity. But even those Jews that had, they had the word of Moses, it told of Christ coming. So, but in principle, they should have been able to resolve this based on the word of God. But their hearts wasn't right.
Right. You're right. You know, and that's why you go through all these things. Later on, when we get into the chapter 22, is when in chapter 22 it's pointed out that as Paul's teaching, he's standing there, he's giving a defense as he's been seized by the Jews, and he's speaking to them, and the Jews were intent. But then he points out he had to turn to the Gentiles because the Jews had decided not to accept the gospel message. Some of them had, but as a whole, more were rejecting and accepting. Also deal with that in Romans in chapters 9, 10, and 11, or a unit of chapters, dealing with the fact that the Jews rejected the gospel, and the message has gone to the Gentiles. And so the Gentiles have now been accepted, and the Jews rejected it. And he gives reasons, talks about that in 9 and 10 of Romans. But yes, they had just gone on, just tried anything they could to try to suppress the truth and keep from having to accept it.
The opposition, see, people don't want to deny the stuff, but they don't want to give anything up to sacrifice. They don't want to sacrifice anything that's going to cost them service to God. Well, when Paul casts out the spirit of divination, that young girl, okay, what are they going to do? They're going to lose their prophet. Okay, these Jews throughout, I mean, it was continual opposition from them. They were going to lose their prominence in Judaism. Okay, then Demetrius and those reject it, they'll try to suppress the truth if it in some way is going to cost them something.
Yes, and I think that was what for a lot of Jews, particularly the Jewish leaders, was they realized if Jesus is the Christ, they don't have to leave a place of prominence among the Jews and the party and the religious sect of the Pharisees. After this takes place at the end of verse 17, it's then in verse 18, that Paul stayed many days longer and then took leave of the brothers and set sail for Syria, and with him Priscilla and Aquila at Cenchrea. He had his haircut, for he was under a vow. And they came to Ephesus and left him there, but he himself went to the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. When they asked him to stay for a longer period, he declined. But on taking leave of them, he said, I will return to you if God wills, and he set sail from Ephesus. So Paul leaves from Corinth and travels down to Ephesus. Priscilla and Aquila go with him. That's important. We're going to come back to them here in just a moment when we get down to Apollos. But they leave from there and come on down to Ephesus. What we find Paul doing in Ephesus at the latter of verse 19? Same thing he does everywhere else. He goes to the synagogue and he reasons with the Jews from the Scriptures. And so he goes down there, and just like he did in Corinth, just like he did in Athens, like he did in Philippi, but they didn't have a synagogue, so as he did by the riverside where the people would gather to pray, as he did in Berea, in Thessalonica, all these cities, as you read throughout his journeys, when there's a synagogue, he goes there and he reasons with them, first with the Jews, then when the Jews decline, he goes to the Gentiles. He'd go teach the Jews, and would work as well among the Gentiles like he did in Athens. He was in the synagogue and in the marketplace. So he goes and he talks to them and reasons with them from the Scriptures in verse 19. In verse 20, they ask him to stay longer, but he, it says in verse 20, they asked him to stay longer, but he declined. It's not included if you have an English Standard or a New American Standard. It'll opt for the shorter reading. But the New King James will say, the ESV version says, taking leave of them, he said, I will return to you if God wills, and sets out from Ephesus. The New King James says, but took leave of them, saying, I must by all means keep this coming feast in Jerusalem, but I will return again to you, God willing. And he set sail from Ephesus. And so he was trying to get back to Jerusalem for a feast. And so he sets out, he's leaving there from Ephesus to go down to Jerusalem for this feast. Why he felt he needed to keep this feast, we don't know, but he felt he needed to go down and keep the feast. This feast that was coming up in Jerusalem, and so he leaves from there and he goes down to Jerusalem. He told them, though, that if God wills, he would return, and he does return back to the city later on, as well as he writes a letter to those here in Ephesus. We have that letter recorded for us in the book of Ephesians. And so he comes down from there. He says, if God wills, he'll return. So he sets out from there to return to Jerusalem in verse 20 and verse 21. It's then in verse 22 that he landed at Caesarea, and then he went up and greeted the church, and then went down to Antioch. So he landed at Caesarea, then he greets the church, and then he heads on to Antioch. So from Jerusalem to Caesarea to Antioch is where he goes. And then in verse 23, he spent some time there. As we find Paul in each of his journeys, each of the three journeys began at Antioch, Syria. Each of the first two ended at Antioch. The third doesn't, because he goes to Jerusalem, and that's where the Jews take him into custody, and then we have him sent off to Caesarea before he eventually makes his way to Rome. But Paul returns to Antioch, sort of home base for him, if you will. He comes here quite often. Chapter 11, if we remember, going back to chapter 11, the church at Antioch was the first largely Gentile, uncircumcised Gentile church. Barnabas was sent by the brethren at Jerusalem to go there. After Barnabas got there, he went and got then Saul of Tarsus to come with him. It was then at the end of 11, they were told about what was going to take place in the area of Judea. And so they sent money to help the needy saints in in that area. Paul, then Saul and Barnabas took that down, and then after they took that down to the area of Judea, they go right back to Antioch, and they work with the brethren there. Then they take off from the first journey in chapter 13, and when the journey is done, they come back to Antioch at the end of 14. In chapter 15, that's where they are when that issue over circumcision arises. They leave from there and go to Jerusalem, but when they go discuss this at Jerusalem in chapter 15, they go back to Antioch again. And then after that, this second journey, Paul journeys and comes right back to Antioch. And so Paul keeps coming back to Antioch and working with those that are there in Antioch at the end of these journeys, again with the exception of the third, because he's going to be sent to prison. After spending some time there, in verse 23, he departed and went from one place to the next through the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. So what is mentioned here in verse 23 is the beginning of the third journey. When we get into the next chapter, we're going to be following through more of the third journey. But what happens in verse 23 is the start of that journey as he goes through the regions of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. So real quick, we'll come back here. Coming through here, he goes from here up to the areas of Galatia and then Phrygia up through here. He goes up to strengthen the brethren, and then he'll set out for doing his third journey. Again, more about that starting in the next chapter. What he goes about doing on this journey, at least here at the beginning, is he's going through and strengthening the disciples. So you can think about the journeys of Paul this way. As we go through Paul's 3 journeys, if you go back to his first one, so you go back to Acts chapter 13 beginning, the purpose of the first journey was, at least the first half of that journey was focused on the establishing of churches. They were going and converting people. Then they go for the second journey, and the decision was reached at the end of chapter 15 that they were going through and they would strengthen those that were already there. They'd gone back through and strengthened them on the way back to Antioch. That's when they established elders at the end of chapter 14 at the church. And then chapter 15 at the end and then 16, Paul told Barnabas they should go on the journey to strengthen churches. As we find them in 16, beginning, they went through Derbe and Lystra. They went through, in the early part there, that's when Timothy started to join them. And then verse 5 said they were strengthened in the faith, the churches were strengthened in the faith and increased in numbers daily. It was then they were told not to go into, as they went through Phrygia and Galatia, same area he's going through now, that they were forbidden by the Holy Spirit to go into Asia. And then from there, they set out where they have what we refer to as Macedonian call, and they go through these areas like Philippi, Athens, Thessalonica, and that's when the churches in these areas are established. In the work that's being done on the latter half of Journey 2. Journey 3, as we set out, is focused on strengthening the churches that are already there again.
Another principle today, we may be instrumental in converting someone to Christ, but we talked about the blood there earlier. Well, there's a continual responsibility to try to solidify that faith in that person, because they're a babe in Christ. We know the devil goes about as a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. Well, he's going to pick off the low-hanging fruit, so to speak. Maybe a new convert doesn't have that, that spiritual strength yet. So I think what we can see in Paul here, there's another lesson for us today, that we don't want to make somebody a twofold child of hell. We don't want to bring somebody in. Maybe, like I said, maybe we're instrumental in teaching that person. What we need to see, there again, out of love, that there's continual responsibility to bring that person along. I believe that's what we see in Paul here is not forgetting about those people, maybe going to other regions, but going back and reaffirming these things, and Peter wrote, he said, I write these things quickly in remembrance, even though you already know them, to stir you up. So, like I said, there's a principle there that I think we can take a valuable lesson with.
Yes, absolutely. And even when he's not visiting these places, you mentioned him already visiting them, he's writing to a lot of the places letters as well to help strengthen them when he can't get to see them For example, we saw Corinth and Ephesus here. He writes a letter to the church at Ephesus. He writes to those in Corinth. Because of the problems there, with Thessalonica, Philippi, we see him writing letters that we have and spend time studying, that he writes to them to help strengthen them further as well.
Micah, I have a question. Straighten me out here. Verse 8 says that Crispus is the ruler of the synagogue. When you go to 17, then it says Sosthenes, or however you pronounce that, is the ruler of the synagogue. Is that different synagogues in the same city, or is that two different cities?
So I think it's the same synagogue. Crispus was the ruler.
What?
But now that he's converted, he won't be practicing Judaism, which is what's going on in the synagogue. So now, that's when you have a new ruler of the synagogue. That would be there. Crispus would have, after obeying, likely stepped down and then been replaced as the ruler of the synagogue because he was converted. Coming out of verse 24, this is where we're introduced to a man by the name of Apollos. In verse 24, it said, at the beginning, it says, Now a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. He was an elegant man, competent in the Scriptures. He had been instructed in the ways of the Lord, and being fervent in spirit, he spoke and taught accurately things concerning Jesus, though he knew only the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue, but when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. And when he wished to cross to Achaia, the brothers encouraged him and wrote to the disciples to welcome him. Now when he arrived, he greatly helped those who through grace had believed, for he powerfully refuted the Jews in public, showing by the Scriptures that the Christ was Jesus. So here we're introduced to Apollos. What we know about him is he's somebody, here in the early part, he's somebody that's a very competent speaker and a good speaker, and he's somebody that's well versed in Scriptures. But there's only one problem. He knew only the baptism of John. And so while he's very confident as a speaker and he's very well versed in the Scriptures, he only knows the baptism of John. And so Aquila and Priscilla correct him on that in verse 26. They correct him on that and explain to him more accurately, or the way of God more accurately. Credit to Apollos. What does Apollos do? He's willing to listen to that. When they're pulled aside. Here's a man who didn't let his knowledge or his abilities stand in his way when he was confronted with the fact that, hey, here's something that he was not, that he did not know. Then he learns that. And then Apollos becomes a great asset to the early church. It's the same Apollos that does a lot of work at Corinth. That when Paul has to write in 1 Corinthians, he talks about how he planted, but Apollos watered and God gave the increase. It's Apollos that does a lot of work there in that is mentioned in 1 Corinthians. Verse 27, he wished to cross to Achaia. So he goes on from there to the area of Achaia. And then this would have been like by the time he ends up in Corinth as he crosses over to Achaia. And as he's getting ready to go there, the brothers had encouraged him, and they wrote to the disciples to welcome him. Here's something I learned. We talked about this before with Saul of Tarsus. When Saul comes to Jerusalem, the people initially are reluctant to accept him. Right? Has he really been converted? It's then that Barnabas gives the endorsement of him that, hey, he's really been converted, here's the work he's doing. Here Apollos is leaving, and he's going to Achaia. But the brethren send word and write to the disciples to welcome him. So they know when he gets there, that he really is that those that are in Ephesus say about him, speak highly of him. Here's somebody that is a believer. Here's somebody that is teaching the truth. They write for those to welcome him. He comes into Achaia and greatly helps those who through grace had believed. So he helps those who had believed. Paul's gone back to Jerusalem now, but here's Apollos, somebody that's helping to strengthen those that are already there. That's why Paul planted, but Apollos watered. He comes through and is helping strengthen those at the churches already established. He powerfully refutes the Jews in public. With his knowledge of the Scriptures, he shows from the Scriptures and by the Scriptures that Christ was Jesus. And you can imagine Paul saying here, showing here's the things that Jesus did, here's the Old Testament scriptures, Jesus fulfilled them. And he powerfully refuted the Jews, which will help strengthen the brethren and convert more to obey the gospel as well. We'll pick up in chapter 19 on the third journey on Wednesday evening.